Fantastic. Thanks very much for that introduction. So it's a pleasure to be here at Georgetown. Hopefully in the future I can be in the US in person. Back in 2020, I think I had 2 or 3 US trips lined up, and they all ended up getting postponed or cancelled. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is discuss my research on Taiwan's Green parties. The book, as Christine mentioned, came out in March of this year, but it was a long struggle. It took me almost 9 years to get this book out, and in many ways it's kind of like my second PhD book, and that's part of the reason why it took a long time to develop in the midst of regular teaching and admin pressures. So what I try and do in this book is tell the history of Taiwan's Green parties since the mid-1990s. So to an extent then, it's also my attempt to tell the history of both Taiwan's civil and also political party system for that period in time. And I'm trying to do it in a slightly different way from some of the existing studies. In terms of political science, the focus in Taiwan has tended to be on mainstream parties, while the focus from the civil society perspective has been on civil society NGOs. So I'm trying to navigate a path between these two approaches. So what I'm going to do then in today's talk is talk a little bit about how I ended up writing a book on Taiwan's Green parties. This was never something that I planned. It was a project that kind of developed and took a life, kind of gained a life of its own. And I'll talk about some of the personal and academic justifications for the project. I'll talk about some of the research questions that guide the project, and also about some of the research material field work that made this project so enjoyable, and I found it very hard to kind of stop this project, even though the book is now out. I'll briefly talk about the chapter structure of the book and touch upon some of the stories that I used to kind of answer those key research questions. And then last of all, I'll talk a little bit about what I've been doing since the book came out. So my research or my interest in Taiwan's political parties and small parties really originates from my time as an undergraduate student when I was studying Chinese. I was in Taiwan in 1989 for the first semi-democratic multi-party election. And at that time, a number of movement-linked parties did try to enter Taiwan's party system. So I already had that interest. And when it came to doing my PhD, I had a focus on party change, particularly focusing on Taiwan's mainstream parties for the first decade and a half of multi-party politics. And that led to my first book in 2005, Party Politics in Taiwan. Well, 2 of my political party cases were mainstream parties, the Kuomintang and the DPP. My third party case was the New Party, a party that split away from the Kuomintang, KMT. And that really kind of really got me interested academically in Taiwan's small parties because of the way that the party often acted in ways that seemed irrational, electoral suicide from the perspective of mainstream parties. Why would a party sometimes put policy or ideology ahead of winning elections? So this led me to write my first article on Taiwan's small parties that came out around the same time as Party Politics in Taiwan, which looked at Taiwan's small and new parties. So I tried to kind of tell the history from the late 80s through to the early 2000s. And in that paper, I kind of forgotten about that paper for a long time. And when I went back to reread that paper, I discovered that I did have a couple of very short paragraphs on the Taiwan Green Party. But at that stage in 2005, the Green Party was really no more than a footnote for me. It wasn't really something that I could imagine spending almost 10 years and writing a book on. But what changed was an email from one of my former students who had been studying at SOAS in our anthropology department. And I was very kind of fascinated by the fact that a couple of weeks after she submitted her master dissertation, she started to campaign for Taiwan's parliament, standing for the Green Party Taiwan for the January 2012 elections. So from what I've studied on mainstream parties, I know how long it takes to get elected, how much preparation is involved. Often it will take years of preparation to win election. But in this case, this student of mine was standing with just a couple of months' time to campaign, with minimal resources. And then after she failed to get elected, she then went on to become the co-convener of the Green Party Taiwan. And in October of 2012, she sent me an email asking if I'd be interested in doing some kind of research on the party. And I was kind of between projects. I just finished the Government Politics in Taiwan book, so I was looking for something short-term to research. So I, together with a Taiwanese academic, Peng Yongwen, who was a former Green Party leader and academic, we put together a research proposal. So I think in many ways this link in the way that I was influenced by my own student is something I think is really so common in the university that I work at, SOAS. And just as a kind of like a side story, a really good example of the way that I've been influenced by my students is one of your professors at Georgetown, Adam Lifshitz, who came to study at SOAS a few years ago as a professor, and he took our MA Taiwan Studies. And I'm pretty sure that he taught us a lot more than we taught him. He's a kind of a Philippine literature kind of specialist. And he kind of helped us to start to think about Taiwan from different angles and to compare Taiwan with the Philippines. So these are two examples in the way that I as an academic have been heavily influenced by my own students, which I think is one of the reasons why as an academic we can cope with what is often a challenging job. Okay, so back to the story. So together with Professor Peng Yongwen, we set up a couple of focus groups to try and get a sense of the history of the Green Party. And these focus groups were just so different from anything I'd done before with mainstream political parties. The focus on ideology, the focus on idealism, really kind of hooked me on the subject. The arguments, I was quite shocked by this, but it really increased my curiosity in the project. So even though it looks like all smiles in this picture, there was a lot of anger in this focus group. So gradually over the next 8 years, I kind of built up more data that really it was the kind of data that wouldn't be it would be kind of wasted on a couple of journal articles, and it really needed a book length focus. So let me then say a few words about the academic justifications for looking at a political party that's not especially successful. Now, if we think comparatively, there were a lot of books or a number of books written about the Green Party in the UK, well before it finally got seats in our parliament. In contrast, the Taiwanese Green Party actually wins seats in parliament less than 2 months after it's first established. And sometimes looking at failure can be as interesting as looking at success, as we see when we think about the coverage of some failed Labour Party campaigns in the UK. Now, one of the challenges when we look at a country like Taiwan is how to actually connect it with broader literatures. And the way that I try to do this is to situate Taiwan within this literature on small and movement parties. So I'm trying to look about whether these kind of theories and frameworks that have been applied for European countries work in the Taiwan context. And you can see that in the some of the frameworks that I use in the book. Another advantage to this project is that it enables me to engage with the literature on global green parties, which is a really big literature in European party politics. But there wasn't yet a book on Asian green parties. So it was a chance to do something new within a big literature. But also I wanted to try and contribute to the Taiwanese literature, both on political parties and civil society. And that's what I think I try to do. But I think there's also some specific reasons that make the Green Party worth studying. The party, as we'll see in some of the chapter discussions, has often been ahead of its time on a range of issues. It's been willing to touch issues that other parties are not prepared to touch. For example, it's often been ahead of its time on gender. It's the first party to have a female party leader, the first party to have a male-female co-convener leadership structure, the first party to nominate openly LGBT candidates and to advocate same-sex marriage. It's also interesting in terms of its international engagement. Although many Taiwanese political parties do join international party clubs, the Green Party takes this international engagement the most seriously through its engagement with the Global Greens network. And a very good example of this is one of the people who first helped me in those initial focus groups back in 2012 went on first to be the convener of the Asia Pacific Greens network, and then went on to become the convener of the Global Greens, the organization for all the Green parties in the world. And a third reason that I think makes the Green Party interesting in Taiwan is because of the role that its leaders have played in such a wide range of social movements. So one of the reasons why many of these people who feature in this book are familiar to SOAS audiences is because so many of them have come to SOAS to speak both about their academic research, but also about their social movement experience in areas such as the feminist movement, the LGBT rights movement, as well as various environmental movements. Okay, so then let me come on to the kind of the big questions that really drive the research. And I divide them into how, who, so what, and why questions. So it's a little bit more ambitious than the PhD, which was much more focused on a smaller group of questions. And that may be one of the reasons why the book was longer than the publisher would have liked. But I had a little bit more leeway than if this had been a PhD project. I can imagine I would have had some problems in a PhD vibe. So the how question really looks at how the party has changed over 25 years, particularly ideologically, but also in terms of its organization. The who question looks at what kind of people have led and supported the party over time. The so what looks at electoral results and international engagement. And the why question, which I probably devote the most time to, looks at questions such as, why did the party form? Why did the party change? And how to explain the party's formation. So immediately through looking at seeing these questions, it's clear how these questions are actually, these are some of the big questions in the small parties literature. So it enables to engage with those debates on international small parties, particularly the question of what explains small party performance, what explains small party formation. Now, I think if there's one big kind of takeaway from this book, it's that failure is never inevitable. What I try and do in the book is to build up a framework that focuses on both the party system as well as party agency when I'm trying to explain the party's performance. So I look, for example, at the impact of mainstream party strategies, as well as the impact of competing smaller parties in the party system. But I devote the most space to looking at the quality of the party's campaigns. How did it get a balance between party ideals and actually winning votes? And what we generally find is that the party performs better when it gets the right balance between these two. And coming back to this idea about failure never being inevitable, to a certain extent, this picture tells this story. The picture is from the 2014 campaign. And it's a set of endorsement photographs where figures from civil society as well as alternative culture have endorsed the party in the run-up to local elections in the autumn of 2014. And if we move forward 2 years, basically everyone in this picture has ceased to support the party. So you can see how the party goes from being in a position when it should be able to make a breakthrough, that it loses the support. So some switch to mainstream parties, some switch to alternative small parties. So it's an example of a lost opportunity. So what I do next then is, in a few slides, just mention some of the methods that I used that I think might be useful, particularly if any of your students are thinking about studying Taiwanese electoral or party politics. So one of them I particularly enjoyed was focus groups, which I hadn't used in the past, both for party leaders and activists, but also for party members, which was, again, was something, and this generated some really good useful data that features a lot in the book. A second key method that comes out a lot is the voices of Green Party activists. I interviewed about 50 party activists over the 8 years, but what made this different was that I was often interviewing the same people over multiple times over those eight years. To a large extent, the interviewing was done in person, often during my winter breaks when I would go back to Taiwan. But I also did supporter interviews, and in the final stage, I did some online interviewing for the 2020 election. I also made use of a lot of online data, which again is one of these great things about studying Taiwan, that so much data is available online, for example, from the Central Election Commission. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why it's possible for students to do really great research on Taiwan electoral and party politics from a distance. Personally, I'm a fieldwork person, but probably the best PhD I've ever examined was done by a student who didn't go to Taiwan during his 4 years of a PhD. And that's possible because of the availability of online data. So for example, here we have a picture from an online election gazette database, which is really good for doing cross time series analysis, which has things like the candidate names, the candidate education, background, age, and policy proposals. So I can do comparison over time. When I did my PhD and first book, internet really wasn't yet a useful data set, but that's changed so much for this book. So I was using party websites, candidate blogs, social media, and here we will have one example of this, a blog post from a candidate. And I think this also gives us a sense of the kind of appeals that the party is making. Very, very heavily focused on environmental issues in this case. But we also get a sense of the international engagement of the party. So we have endorsement from Australian Greens, Japanese Greens, as well as from alternative cultural figures, such as writers and poets. Audiovisual material was also really useful. The rise of YouTube, again, is a really good source for doing Taiwanese election analysis. So we have a poster on the left, and on the right we have a screen capture from an election ad from 2016, which also gives us a sense of the importance of gender appeals in the party's campaigns, particularly in the last decade or so. Okay, so what I'm going to do next then is just talk about, briefly talk about what I cover in some of the chapters. So for me, probably my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 3, which I call Beautiful Accidents, where I look at the formation of Taiwan's Green parties. Here I need to note that it's, the title of the book is plural rather than singular, because I look at more than one. In fact, I look at 4 different Green parties in the book, which is something actually quite common to international Green parties, which are often prone to splitting because of the arguments that I mentioned in the initial focus group. So I talk about, for example, the way that the Green Party, the official Green Party, was established in 1996 from a concept created by a number of young students. So they come up with the idea and persuade a number of civil society groups to back this this project. And part of the reason for this was disillusionment and lack of trust in the main progressive mainstream party, the DVP. So there were doubts about its sincerity on a lot of social issues, and this led to its formation. But it's also a chapter that makes me feel very sad because it features the main party split in 2014, where a number of the party stars who'd been criticized in those focus groups in 2012 split away to create a new political party called the Trees Party. So the poster we have here is a Trees Party poster from 2014, featuring one of the party stars who was heavily criticized in the focus group, Pan Sen. In chapter 4, I look at the impact of the party, and I measure this through election results and international engagement. So I look at the long-term national progress of the party, but also I look at the party's performance at the district level. So, for example, I look at the case study for, here, where the candidate Goh Meng-ding enters Parliament for the Green Party about 6 weeks after the party was established. How did that happen? And then the picture on the right is from the Green Party's visit to the UK for the Global Greens Congress in 2017, when we hosted both the Green Party delegation, but also the Trees Party delegation to my university. So this is the Green Party's SOAS talk. Chapter 5 looks at the who question. In other words, who are the Green parties? And I think this picture gives us a sense of the party's nature. So on the far right, we have the first female leader of the any Taiwanese party. Then we have Goh Cheng-yen, who's one of the party founders, a really hard, experienced environmental leader and university professor. So a lot of the people that feature in the Green Party's history are actually academics with PhDs. We have a visit from an Austrian Green Party figure, and also we have Linda Arrigo, who was the party's international officer in the much of the latter part of the 1990s. which again reflects the international nature of the party. The fact that an American could play a leading role in a Taiwanese party, again, shows its international nature. And she plays a key role in linking the party up with Australian, Japanese, and European Green parties. Chapter 6 then looks at the party's first election campaign in 1996. And I call this chapter Professor Gao Catching Missiles. And here I look at the way the party was actually able to perform very well in this first campaign, despite having very limited resources. And one of the ways that it was able to compete with mainstream parties was engaging with this critical issue of national identity and relations with China. So if you followed Taiwanese political history, you'll be aware of the 1995-1996 missile crisis at the same time as the first presidential election. And in order to engage with this issue, Gao Xiangyan goes out into the Chinese missile zone to show that his party is standing up to the Chinese threat. And this would be critical in gaining the party mainstream media attention, which was so important in the pre-social media and internet campaigning era. And also this incident also gives the party international media attention, and is the reason why the Green parties in Europe first became aware that a Taiwanese Green Party had been established. And in fact, an important leader of the England and Wales Green Party comes to Taiwan during that campaign as a result of hearing about the formation of the party. In chapter 7, the focus shifts to local elections. And I look at how the party tries to build on its initial success in 1996 at the local level. But the overall picture is actually disappointing. In other words, the party, while having quite a lot of competitive candidates in its first election, only has one competitive candidate, Peng Yan-wen, who goes on to work with me on this in this project. So the puzzle here that I look at is, why was her campaign especially successful? And again, I look at a mixture of party system factors, such as new competing parties, small parties, but also problems and positive points in the campaign that actually enable her to attract the critical mainstream media attention that allowed her to almost get elected. So after this campaign, often Green Party figures would ask why her campaign was different and why didn't she quite make it into the Taipei City Council. The next chapter is a little bit different because it doesn't focus on election campaigns because the party drifts out of electoral politics for the next 6 years after the setback of 1998. So instead, I look at, why does the party collapse and how does the party rebuild itself? And young people are a key feature in the answers to these questions. In other words, many of those young activists that were at the core of the party in the first few years go to study abroad, to do their PhDs or masters. And it's only when they come back that the party starts to rebuild and to rebrand. Peng Yan-wen is one of the key figures in actually rebuilding the party after she returns from studies in the US. And she brings back a very different style of activists into the party. We start to see a changed party image. Next in chapter 9, then I look at what happens when the party starts joining elections again after 2006. And I look at different approaches that the party takes, such as trying to work with labor groups, Red-Green Alliance in 2008. And in 2009, I look at its attempt to make a breakthrough in local elections. But to a large extent, the party isn't yet able to recreate its performance from the 1990s. So again, I'm looking at how the changed party system can explain this, but also problems in its strategy, how it sometimes mishandles its alliances with other groups. So for example, in the 2009 case, the party has a chance to work together with the DUP in this by-election, but mishandles this relationship and ends up having a very, very poor performance, despite the fact that through this treetop protest, the candidate gets a lot of media attention, but it's not enough to make a breakthrough. In chapter 10, then I look at how the party goes from just joining elections to being competitive. And we have a round of organizational reforms. And we start to get performances that are on par with the 1990s, both in the local elections in 2010 and the national elections. The case of, for example, my student who stands in 2012. And we can also get a sense of the party's themes and how they're changing. For example, we're starting to get the first openly gay candidates. For example, Wang Zhongming in this picture. We have the first alliance or informal alliance with the DUP in the case of Pan Han-sen in this case. And we also have a leading Indigenous activist. So the party is trying to diversify its appeal, as well as to work on improving its party organization. However, the party doesn't get into parliament in 2012, despite performing much better than in the past. Then we have a further round of reorganization following the party split with the Green Party and the Trees Party. And we have a key environmental organization figure taking the lead in the party, trying to build local party branches. And in 2014, we have the first breakthrough. The party starts to win its first seats at the local level, and probably should have done even better. And that's why I call this chapter Unfinished Progress, because the party does make breakthroughs, but probably could have done better. So it wins seats in a number of local councils in 2014. But of course, there's the disappointment of the party split. And here again, we can see that the party is again nominating a number of openly LGBT candidates and LGBT activists, as well as environmentalists. When it comes to 2012, this is the year when the party really looks like it's going to make a breakthrough at the national level. It's looking good in the polls, it's better organized, it's better funded than ever before, and it's working together in alliance with a party that was created after the Sunflower Movement, with many high-profile candidates. So here the puzzle is, why does the party only go from 1.7 to 2.5% of the national vote? And parties need 5% to get into parliament. It looked like the party had that potential in the early polls in this election, but eventually it doesn't live up to those expectations. And again, I look at changing party system factors, such as the arrival of a new movement party, the New Power Party, which does enter parliament, as well as problems in the party's campaign and the way that it mishandles, for example, its relationship with the Social Democratic Party that drags the party down. Then we have a further round of rebuilding and rebranding and a new leadership structure for the next round of local elections in 2018. But what we see in this campaign is the party is putting much more focus on winning elections and much less focus on party idealism. And that's why I call this chapter Winning or Selling Its Soul. So by this stage, although the party does improve its performance, many of its traditional supporters were no longer willing to support the party. And these two quotes reflect those distinct views on the party's direction. And then we come finally to the most recent election that I look at in the book, the last round of national elections, where on the surface it looks like a return to the past, with the Professor Gall's return to stand for election, the one who tried to catch missiles. But the focus of the campaign was actually on two figures, on the controversial attack-minded Wang Haoyu, as well as the well-known psychiatrist and TV personality, Deng Huiwen. So we have very, very contrasting styles of campaigning. And what I found was that, again, so many of the former supporters weren't willing to support the party, largely as a result of the campaigning style of this internet star, Wang Haoyu. But the puzzle we have in this campaign is, why does the party, again, get 2.5%? It loses so much of its original support, but it gains quite a lot of new support, largely due to Deng Huiwen. So if it had kept its original support base, plus the new support base, it should have got into parliament. And then in the final chapter, the conclusion, I look at what happened after the election, how the party tries to rebrand itself, to reconnect with social movements that the party had alienated in the past 3 years, such as labor and environmental groups. And lastly, I talk about some of the practical lessons of how the party could improve its performance in the future. Something that I would never imagine doing for a mainstream party. But I think when we study a movement party, often it's easy to get involved emotionally with the party. Now, since the book's come out, I've been working much harder than ever in any of my publications on promoting this book. Most of the talks I've done have been online talks like this one, but it's been really fantastic to start doing in-person talks. So I've done for example, in this picture, I'm doing a talk for a local Green Party branch near to where I live in the UK, and I've to an audience that has no idea about Taiwan or Taiwanese politics. And one thing I got out of this was that Green Party members in the UK feel really similar to Green Party members in Taiwan in terms of their kind of profile. And I've just taken the second photograph comes from a Facebook post from a former Green Party candidate from his Facebook today, where he's saying goodbye Green Party. Because I think if we're looking ahead to the Green Party's future, the next big test is the local elections in I think November of 2022. And in this case, a Green Party candidate who I was hoping would be standing today announced that he was leaving the party. So one of the tragedies of the Green Party is that so many of its candidates have just stood once and then never stood again. And this seems to be one such case. Because in the last chapter, I talk about one of the things I suggest the party should do is to reach out to former candidates, to bring them back and to not lose these rich experience and human resources. And the other thing that I've been doing since the book came out has been working on a Chinese version of the book. And rather than a translation, what I'm doing is working together, is more a rewriting of the book, working together with 3 former party leaders and activists who've gone on to be junior or senior academics. So Peng Yongwen, who I work with right from the start, who didn't work with me on the English book, but has rejoined the project, together with 2 younger party leaders. So they cover different periods of the party's history, and we're hoping to finish drafting the book towards the end of this year. And again, we're hoping that it will have some practical lessons that may be able to help the party in this next round of elections. And lastly, if you want to get the book, don't buy the book, or don't buy the hardback because it's just too expensive. But I'm really delighted to see that you have the book, the ebook in the Georgetown University Library, and hopefully we'll have the paperback out next year, together with the maybe around the same time as the Chinese version. So I really would love to hear your thoughts on the book. So if you get time to read it afterwards, just feel free to get in touch with me. And that's where I'm going to finish. I look forward to your questions. I hope I've more or less, I think I've stayed within the target of about 40 minutes. So thanks very much again for the invitation. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Feld, for that really interesting talk. I really enjoyed how you walked us through the whole process of your research from your early interest in this, and then because it took place over such a long period of time, talking about each stage of the research was really interesting for me, and I'm sure others in the audience. Before I open it up to everybody on the call, I just want to ask one big and tough question, which is, can you fill in so what is the significance of studying the Green Party question a little bit, right? Like if somebody wants to understand Taiwanese politics, why should they read this book and try to understand the Green Party, which has not been that successful in, it hasn't broken through reaching that 5% threshold to get into the parliament, right? So what are the kind of key insights about Taiwan's politics that you think this study of a non-mainstream party can offer to somebody? I think you're muted still. Or I can't.
Yeah, fantastic question. Well, I think often the mainstream parties have felt very threatened by the Green Party and other alternative parties. So we can see this in the way that the mainstream parties have tried to undermine or co-opt the party. But I think that's actually a positive for the party's history. That it's able to influence, particularly the most proximate mainstream party, the DPP. So we can see this, for example, if we think about the topic of same-sex marriage, which the party first puts on the electoral agenda in the early 2000s. And gradually over time, as the DPP feels threatened by these new social movement linked parties, it does poach the issue in 2016. But it's not just poaching the issue, it's also poaching Green Party leaders. So for example, in the 2016 election, the DPP poaches my student, who had been the Green Party leader just a few months ago. She's recruited to stand and elected for the DPP. And in fact, in that election, the DPP nominates 2 former Green Party leaders and 2 more former Green Party candidates. So that is a way that the party will influence the mainstream parties through politicians, but also through issues. And we see this again and again, the way this kind of poaching of personnel and ideas. So it's always a challenge to the Green Party, but maybe it's a mark of success, the way that the party is able to, or the party's politicians are able to influence the mainstream party. And we see this again in 2020, when the party poaches a number of politicians that stood for the Green Party Social Democratic Alliance in 2016. One goes on to be a cabinet minister for the environment. Another goes on to be a party list DPP legislator. So the study of these kind of parties, we see a different angle on Taiwan's party system. And we can see how diversity is brought into the party system, despite not winning so many seats. So from the Green Party's perspective, it could be seen as a failure, but the fact that DPP keeps trying to do this shows that threat, and we see that threat the whole way through. So I think that when we're looking at small parties, the way we understand success has to be a little bit different. Sometimes just getting these issues on the agenda are important. These issues that are neglected by mainstream parties, things like the death penalty, which is a very, from a European perspective, it's quite surprising how supportive public opinion is for the death penalty. And the fact that the Green Party has at times been willing to take a stand on an unpopular issue, again, I think is really important.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful and interesting. Do other people on the at the talk have questions for Dr. Fell? Nathaniel?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Fell, for your talk. I'm Nathaniel. I'm one of the Asian Studies students here. I kind of had a two-part question. The first question is, you kind of mentioned the relationship between Green Party and civil society. And I'm just wondering what your take is on kind of the health of civil society in Taiwan. It does seem, you know, from what you've said, that it is kind of fractured or personalistic, or, you know, a lot of small different groups, as opposed to kind of like a more unified voice. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And the second question is kind of a more general question. I'm just curious to hear your take on kind of the state of Taiwan studies, especially vis-a-vis, you know, China studies, and trying to be separate or a part of that. And also, you know, do you think there is a future for young scholars who are interested in Taiwan? Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I love both these questions. Health of civil society in Taiwan. I would say it's very, very healthy. I think one of the things that really makes Taiwan exciting is the diversity and the strength of social movement groups. I remember a few years ago when I finished at the end of the term, and one of the students came up to me and said that the thing she most admires about Taiwanese politics is that protest matters. In the UK, we often get quite disillusioned with protests, that basically it doesn't seem to get anywhere. While in Taiwan, my sense is that political parties do really try to engage with protest. So they don't tend to, even though they often want to ignore protests. And we saw that, for example, in the case of the same-sex marriage debate. Even though the DPP had campaigned on same-sex marriage in 2016, it hesitated to pass that legislation as a result of protests from conservative groups. And of course, we also saw this, the impact through the sunflower movement case, which I think, well, I should say that students at my university like to protest. It's part of the SOAS way of life to protest. And they're so used to being beaten up by the police in the UK and getting harshly treated and getting nowhere. And then they see the stories of coming out of Taiwan, and I think they often find that quite inspiring. And I think a further way that I would answer your question, I'm thinking to one of my students' presentations yesterday, was she was talking about reasons for the impact of progressive values in Taiwan. And of course, one of them is the party system. But I think that the civil society puts pressure on the party system and influences the mainstream parties, particularly the DPP. So it's been much more kind of adaptable in the face of civil society. So I think that's an area where I'm really kind of positive, particularly when I'm thinking comparatively with places like Japan. I think it's that's a real sign of health of Taiwan's democracy. Your second question is a question that because I've been involved in Taiwan studies since I was a student, and I've been involved in because Christine mentioned my work with the European Association. So I've been trying to build Taiwan Studies through organizations such as the European Association, as well as building up Taiwan Studies at my own university. So that led me to write a number of pieces about the state of Taiwan Studies, particularly in Europe. And one of those pieces that was quite well received was a blog article called, I think it was called "The Golden Age of Taiwan Studies?" ? And I've got a few other similar pieces that I've published over the last 10 years on that topic. So overall, I would say I'm very, very positive about the state of Taiwan Studies, particularly if I compare to what it was like when I started out as a student, where Taiwan Studies was almost non-existent in the UK, and we had to go to the US to join Taiwan Studies events. So I used to go to North American Taiwan Studies conference because we didn't have a European conference, and I wanted to bring back that experience to Europe. And if you look at things like the series that I edit, we've published something like almost 40 books over the last 10 years in that series. We now have the International Journal of Taiwan Studies was created by one of my colleagues, let's say 3 years ago, which again I think is really exciting. And in Europe itself, now we have about 10 Taiwan Studies programs throughout Europe, and they're quite. I'm naturally I'm going to say the SOAS is the best, but there's some really good programs in Europe, particularly at Tübingen is a really good, strong program. So I'm very positive. One last point I will make is that when I published some of those recent pieces, I was challenged by some US-based writers who weren't quite so convinced. So my sense overall is that the mood of Taiwan Studies is probably more upbeat in Europe than America. But I think there's a lot of really positive developments in America at places like Austin. And I think that even in the US, there seems to be some pretty strong Taiwan programs at the moment. So thanks for two fantastic questions.
Next, we have Eduardo.
Thanks so much for speaking to us today. So I can't really help but kind of think about the US politics in comparison, just because that's kind of what I know when thinking about Taiwan. And in the US, it feels like we see increasingly there's polarization, and the stakes of each election feel so high that people are very reluctant to vote for a third party, or more reluctant than they might have been, say, 20 years ago. You want to make your vote count. Is that a dynamic that you see in Taiwan as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, of course, we do have these two mainstream parties that really dominate Taiwan's party system. And that's meant that Taiwan has a very, very stable party system, which is one of the reasons why it's a nice case to look at. But there's always been some space for alternatives, right since probably since the mid-1990s. I think one of the reasons that makes Taiwan different from the US is the electoral system. So prior to 2005, it had a multi-member district electoral system, and which is kind of semi-proportional, not entirely proportional, but slightly similar. And then after 2005, they changed their electoral system to a two-vote system. So that meant that generally people would vote for a mainstream party in your single-member district. But on your second vote, where you vote for a political party, that's the kind of key territory for alternative parties. I mean, you still have to get that 5%, which is not easy. But I think that's one of the reasons why we do see some space. But there are always challenges, because Taiwan's parliamentary elections are held on the same day as the presidential elections. The two often influence each other. And it's kind of going back to, I think, to some of the points I was making with Christine's earlier question. The DPP, which is the Progressive Mainstream Party, will often, in the last week of the campaign, make those last-minute kind of social movement appeals, and try and kind of win back those votes who are looking to split their vote. So that is always a challenge. How do you deal with that, particularly if the China factor comes up into the election? And the China factor often will override social issues. So that's one of the challenges for alternative parties. How do you deal with the China factor when you have other kind of more national identity oriented parties? So I think a lot of it is down to quite a different electoral system. I think that's one thing that gives a little bit more space, but also to do with demand and the alienation with mainstream parties. So often people, I guess it's probably a bit like that in the US, that you've got to vote for one of the two, even though you may actually dislike the closest mainstream party. But at least in Taiwan, you do have that choice, both on the party list, but also at the local level. And that's why I'm quite curious about what's going to happen in the 2022 local elections.
Next, we have Grace.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. I was just wondering if you could talk more about the Green Party's engagement with young people. Based on my understanding, young people have taken a much stronger stance within Taiwanese politics. And I was wondering if they've lost supporters, has it been young people since they kind of switched from focusing more on getting votes rather than ideology? And as they move forward into these upcoming elections, is this rebranding process you talked about, how is that going to involve young people?
Yeah, fantastic questions. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Green Party is it has been its youth focus. It's tended to nominate much younger candidates than any of the other parties, often candidates that are students or just graduated students. It's been much more willing to focus on youth-oriented issues. So, for example, things like stagnant wages, the kind of gap between, or job security is another one that they've put a lot of stress on. And when we looked at the party support base, again, it was overwhelmingly younger voters. And maybe the middle-aged voters that it did support tended to be those that had experience with protest or different NGOs. So there was clearly that kind of youth focus, and they've managed to kind of keep that despite the different periods of leadership reorganization. I would say that they struggled with that with the 2018-2020 campaigns, when they were shifting away from the kind of social movement appeals. So I think that was an issue, and I'm not sure to what extent that they've managed to regain that. Because one of the things I'm not so comfortable talking about is what's happened to the party since I finished the research for the book, because I've not been back to Taiwan since 2018. My hope, personally, I believe that Taiwan's party system needs an alternative party that it brings a more kind of brings diversity into the party system. But then the question is, which party will win that youth vote? Which party will win that social movement vote? I guess the final point that I would add to your question is, I mean, my sense is that over the last 10 years, young people have been much more involved in politics and much more willing to get involved in protest to stand for election. So there seems to be a sea change from the mood of politics in the initial post-2000 period. And I can see this through my own students from Taiwan over the last decade, about how so many of them have protest experience, which is a little bit, it's kind of challenging. In the early 2000s, there was a kind of stereotype that Taiwanese youngsters didn't care about politics. And that stereotype is really being demolished by what's happened over the last decade or so. So I feel really kind of excited about this. And I think we've seen this in some of the recent elections where the youth turnout has been actually much higher than in the past, even though it's very difficult to vote in Taiwan because you've got to go home to vote. We don't have postal voting in Taiwan. We don't have, so it means that if you're studying in Taipei and your home is in the south, in Kaohsiung, you've got to go home to vote. You've got to take, have a long journey, but the turnout rates are still as good, if not better, than most West European countries. But often it takes, the elections have to look important for that to happen. And we did see that in the 2020 campaign.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? Can I put Dr. Lifshee on the spot, because I noticed that Dr. Feld brought him up in the talk and we haven't met before. I'm curious what you're doing in the Spanish and Portuguese language department studying Taiwan. Can you maybe just introduce yourself really briefly to some of the people on the call and explain how you all know each other?
And Adam, I'm not sure if you were there for the when I was talking about you, but I was basically, what I was telling them was just how we learned much more from you than maybe you learned from us.
Yeah, I was there for that. That was
good. Okay, yeah.
That is very gracious, DAFYDD, and not true. I learned so much from DAFYDD and from SOAS. It was a wonderful experience, and it makes me very, very happy to see DAFYDD here, invited by Georgetown, which I had absolutely nothing to do with, I'm just so thrilled about that. So yeah, I'm a professor at Georgetown in the Spanish and Portuguese department. Technically, I'm a modern Latin Americanist. But my research interests are the presence of Spanish outside Spain and Latin America. And even in my own field, my colleagues are completely unaware, essentially, that there are literary traditions in Spanish from Africa, where I started my research, and from Asia. And specifically, the Philippines was a Spanish colony for centuries and produced its most important literature, at least its most important novels, in Spanish, which, due to the US takeover in 1898, means that no one in the Philippines anymore can read, no one in the Philippines essentially can read Filipino literature in Spanish. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I was looking to, I was in the Philippines, I was in the northern Philippines, a town called Vigan, and I was saying, wow, Taiwan is really close here, like really close. I wonder if it has anything to do with the Philippines in any way. And I was like, that's interesting. There was this whole body of literature produced in Japanese in Taiwan for half a century that can no longer be read by Taiwanese for all intents and purposes, because Japanese is no longer lingua franca. And maybe this is some connections to Filipinos not being able to read their literature in Spanish anymore. And if you think about it, Japan was running the same Japanese empire that was running Taiwan in World War II still was also running the Philippines at that point. And both Taiwan and the Philippines seem to exist under US protection in many ways since then. So I said, I'd like to find out more about this. And I applied for how can I think through this? And I I applied for a fellowship to hopefully learn something about Taiwan, about which I knew nothing. And I found out about DAFYDD's program. It sounded amazing. And I wrote him, I said, I was thinking about coming over if I won this fellowship, taking a few courses. And he said, why don't you do the whole MA program? And I said, that sounds like a great idea. And somehow I ended up, though already a tenured professor here at Georgetown in the Spanish department, as a student in this wonderful program at SOAS, which I cannot recommend highly enough. DAFYDD is wonderful. I learned a tremendous amount, and you can take. I took it with Zhang Biu. I took like social issues in Taiwan. I took a Taiwanese film course, and I still think about Taiwan all the time. And since then, I've been working on, I'm writing a book now on Taiwan and the Spanish-speaking world, and very interested in figures like San Mao, that Taiwanese who traveled to Spanish-speaking Africa and wrote from there. So that, yeah. But I don't want to take away the spotlight from DAFYDD.
Thank you for the introduction of how you got interested in this, though. I think it's really interesting for our students to know about you and to get to see you on this call. And I hope that we can meet in person sometime too. Not to rope you into more kind of like faculty events than you already attend, but like I hope you come to more Asian studies events.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah.
I suppose the one thing I would add, that I think the really exciting thing about Adam is he started to publish on this topic, or some of these topics as well, including I think in the Routledge Taiwan Series as well. So it's and you can imagine what it was like having an American university professor in the classroom with the rest of my students, because I mean we always love to have mature students and see the way they influence the kind of the regular. Slightly younger students, and in the end, one of Adam's classmates went on to co-edit a book with me as well, which shows the kind of that maybe that Adam's had an impact on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I learned more from my classmates and from DAFYDD and his colleagues that you can imagine. It was great, and but thank you, Christian. I hope to meet you too sometime.
Of course, yeah, wonderful. Are there any other questions for Dr. Fell about his research or Taiwan studies, or anything else related to Taiwan's green parties? Okay, if not, I think Nathaniel, is that a question? Did you want to ask some? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, actually, I was really curious to hear more about the focus groups that you did as a part of your research, and like what was that like, and how did you kind of go about doing that?
Yeah, okay, yeah, let me okay, yeah, the focus groups. So I was fortunate that at that point the Green Party, a couple of their leaders and activists set them up. So they made the contacts to, we in the first stage we did 2 focus groups. One was looking at the 2012 election, the most recent one at that point. So we got candidates, activists who'd taken part in that election. That was the really angry focus group. And then, and I think both of them lasted about a couple of hours of discussion. So I had to, we had a kind of set of guiding questions, and I tried to kind of make sure we stayed on those questions. And then the second focus group, a couple of days later, was looking at long-term history. So we got activists from the early period and the middle period, looking at the same set of guiding questions. So those 2 focus groups generate a huge amount of really, really good data, and it features a lot in the book. And I also did party member focus groups, but somehow that wasn't quite so useful. They didn't really kind of focus. They didn't really kind of bring out too much great data. I think the supporter material was useful. For me, it was something quite fresh because I hadn't really done a focus group, but maybe because I've been doing teaching in small class groups. I think that also helps to kind of keep the discussion going. So for me, it was really, really fresh. And I think in future research, I think I might well do focus groups again. So long as, I think they're hard to set up. So I was really lucky that the Green Party helped me set that all up, because I couldn't have done that. And I still am amazed that these people had the patience to sit through 2 or 3 hours of discussion. Will I be, I'm not sure if I would be willing to do that, unless it was something that I really cared a lot about. Maybe I could do a focus group on international Taiwan studies. Yeah, I could do that, but it has to be something I really care about. And back to Nathaniel. So you asked that question. I was wondering whether this was a method that you thought about yourself.
Oh no, this is my first time encountering it, so I'm really fascinated to hear about.
But I know that I've seen some of my students use this kind of method on things such as election advertising and screening pieces of advertising, and then doing focus groups to try and get a sense of their understanding. I think a lot of focus group studies in Taiwan use students as their kind of, because often students have the time and to do these kind of things. So I think that it might be a useful kind of tool, an alternative to interviews, because you get quite a lot of diversity in there, so long as you can kind of control the discussion.
Well, if there's no further questions, I'm going to wrap this up, if only because I have to teach a class in 14 minutes.
Oh no, okay.
But I just want to thank you on behalf of the Asian Studies program at Georgetown for joining us today and sharing your amazing research on Taiwan's Green Parties. Congratulations on your new book and on all of your success in really advocating for and developing Taiwan studies. It was an honor to have you here today as our guest. Thank you so much, Dr. Fell.
Yeah, thanks, Christine, and also to Kelly and everyone who's kind of made this possible. And thanks everyone for your questions. And I really loved your questions, because they're things that, again, I've thought a lot about. Just yesterday, I was talking about some of those youth issues that Grace raised, and Nathaniel's question about the state of Taiwan studies. Again, it's something that I really kind of care about. And if you want to, Nathaniel, if you want to follow up on, if you just kind of Google it, something like the golden age of Taiwan studies, you'll find that my piece, and then there were a number of writers who kind of followed up on that. So it created a really interesting debate, not only on blog, but also even in the international journal, there was some kind of follow-up discussion of that topic.
Great, thank you so much. And I hope next time that we're able to have you visit Georgetown in person. Definitely,
I hope so. I have a feeling that the next North American Taiwan Studies conference is going to be in Washington next year.
Oh, wonderful.
So that will be I need to think about, I need to put together an abstract for that one. I think and if you're interested in Taiwan, encourage your students to apply, because I know for my students, one of the things that they find very, very valuable, and Adam did this, was to actually join these conferences to give papers, and it's always a really good way to kind of develop your research if you get that different kind of feedback. So if you're around, go to join NATSA. Even think about doing a paper, because sometimes master students do get accepted for NATSA, and NATSA was my first ever conference as well.
Yeah, that's great. And please don't be shy about telling us when you're coming to DC. We would definitely organize a talk in person for you when you're here. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining today as well.
Fantastic, thanks.